Hi everybody, and welcome to another video. Today I want to look at how the composer Joe Hisaishi turns a simple melody into a complex contrapuntal texture. I recently transcribed portions of his symphonic poem Nausicaä based on music from the film, and there are a few moments of contrapuntal writing that are worth studying. The first excerpt I'll look at uses a very simple melody found throughout the film score. This particular version from the symphonic poem places the melody in a solo oboe. It's a very classical or even Baroque sounding melody, so when writing contrapuntally against this melody, Hisaishi uses harmonies and intervals that fit that style. So octaves, thirds, sixths, and occasionally fourths or fifths are used, with dissonances treated similarly to a composer from the 18th century. I'm not really concerned today about intervals or discussing consonance versus dissonance here, because that is so dependent on context. You, as the composer, can define the harmonic landscape, and with it, the rules on consonance or dissonance. I'm more interested today in looking at the contour of lines and also how rhythmically and registrally contrapuntal lines fit together. When you want a melody to be heard clearly within a contrapuntal texture, you can find moments within that melody to either increase or decrease the activity of the accompanying contrapuntal line or lines. Pay careful attention to the melodic phrase structure for places within the melody that would allow for a busier secondary line. For instance, in this melody, at the end of every two-measure unit, there is a longer sustaining note, either dotted quarter or a half note. This is a good place to look first. It's fairly typical you see the rhythm slowing down at the end of a phrase. It may even coincide with where the instrumentalist or singer would take a breath. So this would be a great place for a secondary instrument playing a counter line to have their line increase in activity. It's okay if our ears are temporarily drawn away from the main melody at any of these points. To some extent, even these quarter notes at the end of measures 1 and 5 and these repeated eighth notes at the end of measures 3 and 7 would also provide potential opportunities to let the counterline stand out momentarily. Our ears can easily be distracted from listening to a melody by a number of things: quickly moving rhythms, certain melodic leaps, obviously dynamics or certain articulations, and plenty else, I'm sure. So the most important thing here is finding the right balance between writing a supporting line when the melody is active and giving the line something compositionally interesting, especially in these moments highlighted. Register also plays an important role in counterpoint. If I were to write a contrapuntal accompaniment also in the oboe, I would be forced to share a similar register with the melody. The closer in registral proximity a contrapuntal supporting line is to the melody, the more it runs the risk of interfering or distracting us from that melody. In this case, Hisaishi doesn't want to interfere with our ability to hear the melody clearly, so here's what he does in the first four measures. He chose to have a solo bassoon play the contrapuntal line. While timbrally similar, it has a much lower register, and as you can see here, the registers of the two parts are separated. Our ears have an easier time hearing these as two distinct lines within the texture because of this registral separation. And look where the bassoon is most active, at the end of melodic phrases. In those moments, the bassoon goes from being primarily a bassline instrument to a foreground melodic instrument momentarily. Also notice that in the first three measures here, the bassoon waits to enter until the second eighth note of beat 1. This allows the oboe to grab the listener's attention right away. In the next four measures, Hisaishi adds in a third part a static clarinet sustaining note, sandwiched registrally in between the other lines. Now we have three layers: the melodic foreground, which our ears are drawn to the most, then the middle ground, which is that bassoon part that is fairly active melodically, and then the static clarinet background. The other important thing to mention is contrapuntal motion between voices. When do the lines move in parallel motion, that is, in the same direction, either ascending or descending together? When do the lines move in contrary motion or opposite directions? And when is there oblique motion, where one part stays on the same note while the other ascends or descends? I think most great contrapuntal textures have a blend of all three. Contrary motion helps to maintain independence between lines, so notice where Hisaishi features contrary motion between oboe and bassoon. Like many of these measures, in the first measure shown here, when the bassoon is able to stand out more, it's often moving contrapuntally against the oboe. And when Hisaishi wants the bassoon to support the oboe and not stand out as much, he uses more parallel motion. There are obviously exceptions, and like I said, you want to strive for balance, and that includes some oblique motion. The sustaining clarinet note obviously forms oblique contrapuntal motion with the other lines here, so there's all three types of motion in this short excerpt. So this excerpt features a melody and contrapuntal accompaniment, and it's useful to see how Hisaishi supports the melody. Moments later in the symphonic poem, he has a fugue-like string texture, starting in the cello, then the second violins join in, then violas, then first violins. The fugue subject is not really a melody like the last excerpt, so there's a completely different relationship between contrapuntal lines within this texture. Instead of supporting a melody with background or middle ground lines, the idea here is that when two or more voices are present, the lines should maintain their independence on equal footing. That means that rhythmic and registral independence is crucial, and the majority of voice leading is contrary motion, especially between outer voices. Second violins and cello move mostly in contrary motion as the outer voice parts, then first violins move mostly in contrary motion against the lower lines. In my last video, I took a look at this excerpt, also found in the symphonic poem Nausicaä. This is interesting because it starts with the main melody in cello, but then the first violins have the melody here. Like the first excerpt I showed today, the melody appears first, this time with pickups 3/8 notes before the violas enter. This helps to establish this as the more prominent line. And notice that when the cello have longer sustains, the other instruments become more rhythmically active, so they're not getting in the way, except for the first violins at times. The cello have moving parts here, but the first violins are active. It's almost as though Hisaishi is letting the violins make their way from background to foreground gradually, as opposed to suddenly. I find that to be really effective. So by the time we get to here, Hisaishi has already set up our expectations for first violins to be on the melody. Looking at the counterpoint in this second half, he follows a lot of the same principles, although whenever the highest pitched instrument has the melody like it does now, our ears have an easier time focusing on that. So he can let the inner voices be a little more active than normal here, because we're so used to hearing the melody up in the highest register. All right, so those were 3 excerpts from this symphonic poem that I found contrapuntally very interesting. Now, in the remainder of the video, I'd like to demonstrate how I might compose a similar passage. I've written a short melodic phrase with a general idea for the harmonies that I want. For now, I've placed this melody in a high register and the harmonies as block chords in root position. I'll try to take inspiration from Hisaishi, but I don't want to plagiarize, so I have to keep that in mind. Here's what this sounds like, just melody and block chords. I wrote this melody so that there were occasional longer sustaining notes, where I could add a more active counterline. Looking at the first opportunity, my first thought is to have the eighth notes before and after the sustaining note continued in a secondary part. I also want to establish the chord, so perhaps an eighth note part that starts on the C below and ascends up to this E where the melody sits. I want it to outline the C major chord, and I can have it approach the melodic line by step, allowing the melody to sort of take over again in beat 3. Then in the third measure, the melody rests on a whole note, so the sustain is even longer, and there's more opportunity to have a contrapuntal line emerge from the background. And perhaps because there's more time here, an entire measure, maybe the contrapuntal line should be less accompanimental and more melodic in nature. Something that actually sounds like a counter melody and less like a bass line. So I've added an eighth note downbeat that defines the harmony for the measure. Then a counter melody starts the following eighth note. I tried writing a line here that wasn't simply a scale, something with a bit of contour to it and rhythmic variety. I could even let this counterline continue on a bit through measure 4 and actually have it interact contrapuntally with the melody. I'm having this line now work down towards the measure 5A on the downbeat. Now, as the melodic figure for measure 1 and 2 repeats in measures 4 and 5, I can do something similar in the accompaniment as I did previously. Here I have the A minor 7 chord outlined with an ascending eighth note line. This time I continue the eighth notes all the way through the measure. The end of measure 5 now has parallel tenths ascending to the downbeat of measure 6. Now in the last two measures, I realized that I had repeated the same melodic figure from measure 5 to measure 6. Anytime you repeat something like this in the melody, since the audience has heard it before, you can get away with adding more middle and background activity. So I thought this would be an opportunity to continue adding a lyrical middle ground. There's also more registral space between the bass range and the melody range, so I want to fill that out somehow. One way I can do this is by letting the counterline move into that mid-treble clef staff register. This will allow other parts of the texture to fit below, in between the bass range and treble clef staff. Here's what I came up with. And just for fun, I'll add an additional counterline in measures 6 and 7. It's a good idea to vary the rhythmic pacing of your lines, so maybe having quarter notes here would work. Then I decided to have a fragment of the main melodic idea appear in measure 7 as sort of a background idea. So looking over this piano sketch, it appears that I need at least 4 instrumental parts, maybe 5 to cover all of these lines. There's the melody, which could be a single instrument or a group of instruments in unison, then someone to play the bass notes, then these first counterlines that I wrote. I run into a bit of trouble going into measure 6 because now that I'm looking at it, it seems like this counterline splits into 2 different parts. The part that moves up into the treble clef staff underneath the melody, and the part that stays in the tenor range. I'm thinking that I introduce a new instrument group in measure 5 that plays the line moving into the higher register, and I let the first counterline instrument stay in its tenor range. Finally, there's this last bit of music that seems like it might need to be a completely new instrument or pair of instruments. I want to wrap this video up, so I'll just make some quick decisions about instruments and place this texture into string sections. I'll assign the melody to first violins, the bass notes to cello sustains with bass pizzicatos, then the first counterline to violas and the second counterline to second violins. Before I play this, one thing that Hisaishi or other composers might do is to add some sustaining parts to fill out more of the harmony. There's a lot of room here in the second violin part for that, so somewhere in here maybe I let the seconds emerge with slower moving notes, staying in the background until measure 5. Something like this maybe. I think I can improve a few more moments. Right here is one. There's no reason the violas have to release the note on beat 4. They can sustain that note through the measure. Here, I think I can improve how the line gets handed off from violas to cello, so I've overlapped these sections just slightly. And finally, I can make this cello part more interesting, and I think closer to something Hisaishi would do, so I'll give it an arpeggiated texture. At all times, as I'm working through this, I'm playing through the parts together on the piano to make sure that the harmonies formed at any given point in time sound good. I think this all should work. So I've quickly mocked this up with some samples. If you watch my last video, you'll see how I did this, layering orchestral tools Berlin strings with Spitfire Appassionata strings. Here's what it sounds like. So this was just a short 7 measures of music, but I could easily expand this melody, give it a contrasting phrase even, and start to form the basis of a piece of music. I hope this video was helpful, and thank you so much for watching. In my next video, I'll be looking at music from Hisaishi's score to Castle in the Sky, which is another Studio Ghibli film. So stay tuned and see you then.